Joined now by Derek Young of K-State Online. It is one of those special moments in college football when the five-star freshman quarterback does his first huge things in a game. And Avery Johnson, maybe the biggest Kansas State signee ever?
Ever. Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah.
Scores 5 touchdowns in a win against Texas Tech. Derek, what is the buzz like in Manhattan now that they've seen the full Avery?
Yeah, well, they wanted to see him before that, but I think that's probably pretty apparent by the buzz that it's kind of resulted as a part of his performance. I mean, it was one of the not just best performances ever by a true freshman, but Avery Johnson in general tied the school record for rushing touchdowns in a game, which, by the way, was held by his offensive coordinator in Colin Klein. So that makes it kind of interesting in its own right as well. And everyone's going to be pining for him to start this upcoming week when they host TCU in what is a rematch from the Big 12 championship game. That hasn't been announced yet, but I thought it was at least significant that Coach Klieman, who tends to be conservative in what he shares to the media and how he addresses his team and his roster, was at least non-committal when asked if it was still Will Howard's team.
How did they get to the point where they were sprinkling in more Avery Johnson? Because I DM'd you after they lost to Oklahoma State and said, are they going to the kid? And you said, I can't see that happening yet. But a lot of it was Will Howard has been so good for them. Like, how hard is it for them to move if they do make the move?
Right. You got to remember, Will Howard won them a Big 12 championship a year ago against TCU, which is the team that they're about to play this week. So it's really hard, especially it still feels quick to kind of come off the quarterback that led you to your first conference title in about a decade. So it's a tough decision to be had. But I think they knew probably in the back of their minds that something like this was possible, because even in the spring, they said, Avery Johnson arrived there early. He was on campus in January. He's good enough to go now. We have something. They knew even a month of him being on campus that he was someone that they could play right away and provide either a spark or some offensive explosiveness. And then throughout training camp in August, I was like, yeah, this has definitely happened. At one point, I had someone tell me that had seen practices in August. It's like, whenever we put him in, even with the ones, it's a touchdown nearly every time. So I think they knew at some point they were going to have no other choice. Unfortunately for Howard, he hasn't been as good this year as he was last year. So he's kind of forcing that decision even a little bit. Avery got in against Missouri, but Howard's performance against Oklahoma State, I think, ignited this conversation further, because Chris Klieman even admitted they almost played Avery against the Cowboys in Stillwater.
And they might have won if they had. Because and so take us back through Avery Johnson's recruitment, because he's an in-state guy. He's a 5-star quarterback, top 50 recruit. How did Kansas State land him when everybody else in the country wanted him too?
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think they beat out Oregon and Washington, but even after he committed, there was points where Notre Dame and Florida State were not shying away. They were very interested and tried to push for him as well. You can probably thank NIL a little bit. The NIL being the case probably helped Kansas State in this type of situation of keeping a talent like that at home. And they played it right. Colin Klein and Avery Johnson had a remarkable relationship, and he had Kansas State ties. His grandfather really wanted him in Manhattan as well. So it was the benefactor of a local kid that understood, in this case, the maybe NIL value, but sentimental value of being the hometown hero.
Yeah. And it's one of those kind of perfect storm situations too, because it's not just that he's a good quarterback who's from Kansas. He's a good quarterback who's from Kansas, who has this like super long hair and like looks like a comic book character. And his superpower is speed. Like, he looks like the Flash when he's running out there.
Yeah, there's been some comps thrown out, and some of them I probably don't fully agree with. And I don't know, I hate the comparison game, because you're never going to hit it 100%, and you're going to feel like there might be a better one out there. But the Lamar Jackson one is not crazy. just because you are talking about straight line speed with
Yeah.
some wiggle, and a guy that's probably known for his legs more than his arm. But if you underrate his arm, he will catch you.
Right.
We're probably going to see that at some point, maybe this week.
Well, and that the Lamar Jackson comparison is actually not that weird. Only it's so much for a young guy, and Lamar was so good. So even if you start out as poor man's Lamar Jackson and then move on to getting closer to Louisville version of Lamar Jackson, that'll work. That's good enough. But I agree with you, because I think that's what happened with Lamar. Like, if you remember his freshman year, toward the end of the season, he starts coming in there and they're like, oh, he's the gadget guy. He's the running guy. And then by the end of I think he played in a bowl game, I believe against Texas A&M, and he's chucking it all over the field. And they're like, oh crap, this guy's really, really good. And Avery Johnson is so fast and so scary as a runner. It really limits what you can do in coverage.
Yeah, and the speed and the elusiveness and the ability to make guys miss. Everyone's like, well, Lamar Jackson was in a league of his own on that. And he is, from what we know at this point, and then maybe Michael Vick before him, of course. But if you go back into the recruiting world, they do the Nike Spark score. Avery Johnson's almost 20 points higher than Lamar Jackson's.
Wow.
So we're not out of this world when we're kind of comparing the two. But yeah, you can't. The arm is there. Like Avery Johnson, his arm might be further along now than what Lamar Jackson's was, but we'll see if we get to see that as the year goes on. I believe that we will. Another interesting point that you're probably kicking yourself a little bit, or you think about what if you're a Kansas State fan, you see what Dylan Edwards is doing at Colorado. Him and Avery were committed to Kansas State at the same time.
Oh my God. Well, Dylan also then committed to Notre Dame and then flipped. So I don't know that K-State was going to get him he was kind of looking around, but that is can you imagine them in a read option mesh? You're not feeling good as a defense.
No. And you wonder if at some, because a lot of guys everyone seems like transfers at least once, right? So you wonder, and a lot of them go back home. I think TCU and SMU, think about that with the football haven that is Dallas. They are the benefactors of the transfer portal a lot of times because guys want to go back at home at some point.
Yeah.
You wonder if that door doesn't at least stay cracked a little bit at some point.
Yeah. Well, the thing with Avery that I think is interesting is he came in so hyped, but Will Howard was there. And so nobody was saying, you got to start this guy immediately. But it is interesting that you mentioned, because Chris Klieman is very conservative. The idea that he would do this, what do you think it was in the Texas Tech game that made him say, all right, we're going to go with the kid more?
I wonder if it wasn't the plan already going in and seeing what the looks were from Texas Tech, because they said Texas Tech was giving them looks that they knew was going to be conducive to the quarterback run game. But it seemed like it was kind of scripted. Will Howard's getting 2 drives. Unless he's setting the world on fire and scoring touchdowns in both of them, we're going to Avery Johnson. So it seemed premeditated. Now, I say Chris Klieman is conservative, but it's in the way that he handles his personnel. He's not going to make brash decisions too quickly, but he is the same guy that, has changed his complete offensive philosophy from the time that he arrived in Manhattan, changed his entire defensive scheme, and switched to offensive coordinators and switched to Colin Klein. And in doing so, did have to fire his best friend and Courtney Messingham. This is true.
And the Colin Klein piece of it's interesting too, because while Colin Klein was not as fast as Avery Johnson, he was a dual threat quarterback, and Bill Snyder loved offenses that allowed the quarterback to run. I would love to know what Michael Bishop would have looked like in today's offenses. They were so far ahead of their time, but Klein, learned from Bill Snyder, has been that guy. How much does that help as a play caller for somebody like this?
I think it helps in general, especially from Colin Klein, knowing what it's like to be a quarterback at Kansas State and having that pressure on you to be, because you're expected, even though it's Kansas State, you're expected to be a Big 12 champion at some point if you're Avery Johnson. So, and Colin Klein was that when he won a Big 12 championship in Manhattan. They just won the Big 12 championship last year. And I think some of I wouldn't say panic or hesitation or lack of hesitation, I think some of being so willing to go to Avery Johnson this early in the season, because it's unfolded. Like, I had a feeling that we were going to get to this point, but I didn't think it would be so soon. But you got to remember that there were some lofty expectations for Kansas State before this season, that they were expected to compete for another Big 12 championship, for potentially the second consecutive season. And when that starts to fade away as being a potential outcome, I think you're more willing to kind of roll the dice.
Yeah, and so let's talk about what they are going for now. They've only lost one Big 12 game, so they're not out of it. They do play Texas, which already has a Big 12 loss. That feels like that would be the one. Yep. The Missouri loss was bad, and obviously, what are you going to do when Harrison Mevis hits a field goal from Arkansas to win it? Right now. Yeah, but you know it's still out there for them if they want it. They just have to win everything left on the schedule.
Yeah, win everything on their schedule, but that's why that Texas Tech game, and I remember I was on a show prior to that game during the week, and someone mentioned it as a loser leaves town game, which it really was. It felt like the winner of that Kansas State Texas Tech game, considering what they had left on the schedule and who they had left on the schedule, had a pretty grand opportunity in front of them, especially since you basically eliminate the other team in that contest. So I think Kansas State puts themselves, at least you don't have to say, oh, we have no chance now. You can squint and say, man, TCU and Houston look pretty winnable. And all of a sudden, if we do get those games, you're 4-1 in the Big 12 with the game at Texas coming up next on a schedule. Guess what? That's exactly where Kansas State was last year. They were 4-1 in the Big 12 when they were about to face Texas. Now they lost that game, and they actually have a long line of losses in a row to Texas. And then, of course, they won nothing better to send the Longhorns out of the Big 12 with an L.
Well, I think that would be very well received by everyone in the Big 12 office as well, because right now they're not relishing the possibility of an Oklahoma-Texas Big 12 championship game, which is what it looks like is going to happen. But you're right, because TCU and Houston are very winnable games, and then you go into that Texas game, and if you can beat them, then you can, like Baylor, Kansas, and Iowa State's not a given, especially not Kansas or Iowa State at this point, but it's doable. There's a path. And what did the mood change from, post Oklahoma State game in Manhattan to post Texas Tech game?
Yeah, post Oklahoma State, it was like, if you want the fan base, their take, they thought that there was absolutely no way that they were going to crawl back from the depths of the season, because you know how fans are. And I tried to walk them back a little bit from the ledge, but you just can't once that happens, because everyone thought Oklahoma State was kind of not good at all.
I thought they were done. Now they've beaten both Kansas schools, and we're like, Mike Gundy's risen from the dead. So.
Yeah, it's very Mike Gundy of them to do that, by the way. But now you say, oh, maybe the Oklahoma State loss wasn't a bad. You look at what Missouri did, and be like, oh, maybe that loss wasn't as bad. It took a 61-yard field goal, and you lose that game on the road. So you go from losing and everyone expecting what they saw in Stillwater for that performance to be repeated every week and having no hope, to now suddenly we beat a pretty good Texas Tech team on the road, who's probably just pretty unlucky with how their season has unfolded, especially their schedule and what they had to do. And now you have, a lot of winnable games. The only game you can say, man, I don't know how we're going to do this, is at Texas. Everything else appears very realistic at this point.
So everybody's excited about Avery Johnson, but what else do they need to clean up to make this possible, to make it possible to go into Austin with a chance to really have, be in the mix in the Big 12?
They got to form some kind of passing game that seems to have faded from their ability the last 2 weeks. And really, they picked up a big receiver transfer in the offseason, and Keegan Johnson from Iowa. They took him over Notre Dame and Texas A&M, and he just hasn't been healthy enough or confident enough in some of his past injuries that have lingered for him to really surface. And I think that really could ignite the passing offense, because I don't know, without him becoming what they thought he would become and what he was at times throughout the offseason, I don't know how they can turn around that, because I think there might be an issue just personnel-wise at the receiver position. Defensively, man, down to down, you feel really good about what they are doing. It's just like those 4 or 5 plays a game in a game where their youth and inexperience surfaces, and you know how that is. You lose focus for one bit and you miss a run fit, or you're not where you're supposed to be because you haven't played enough football yet at this level or seen enough offensive looks at this level, and you're just not in the right spot, and boom, it's an 80-yard play. So their consistency is actually there. It's just like they need the experience and more reps and snaps because what they're missing is the ability to prevent the big play.
Well, I'm very excited to watch because this changes everything, I think, for Kansas State's season. Avery Johnson, you love it because they always come in as the folk hero, but then sometimes it takes a while to develop. Sometimes they're not what they were advertised to be. It seems like he is, and I'm telling you, folks, if you have not watched him play yet, watch K-State TCU. It's something to see. Derek Young, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples on 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On3 Sports YouTube channel.